For years, Ridgewood High was Jason Calloway's personal kingdom, a place where his cruelty knew no bounds. He wasn't just a bully, he was an unchallenged tyrant, a storm of fists and laughter, always choosing his victims with the confidence of someone who knew he would never face consequences. His father, Richard Calloway, sat on the school board, donated generously to the athletic department, and rubbed shoulders with the kind of people who made rules but never followed them. That privilege wrapped Jason in an armor of untouchability, allowing him to do as he pleased while teachers and administrators turned a blind eye. And among all his victims, Malik Carter was his favorite. Malik learned early on that resisting only made it worse. It started small, snide remarks, mocking glances, accidental bumps in the hallway. But Jason thrived on escalation. Over the years, the shoves turned to slaps, the words became sharper, and the laughter of his entourage echoed louder. Each insult, each hit, was another brick added to the prison of helplessness Malik lived in every single day. And yet, he endured. He swallowed his pride, forced his tears down, and convinced himself that if he just made it through the day, through the week, through the school year, eventually it would end. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was never going to stop. Not unless something changed. Then came the worst beating yet. It happened outside the locker room after gym class, where the teachers wouldn't be watching. Jason and his friends cornered Malik, shoving him against the lockers, laughing as his books scattered to the floor. "You know the drill, Carter," Jason sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Malik clenched his fists, but didn't move. He wanted to fight back. God, he wanted to. But he knew how this game worked. Jason struck first. A punch to the stomach, stealing Malik's breath before he could react. Another hit sent him to his knees. He barely heard the laughter over the ringing in his ears. And when he finally stumbled home that night, bruised and broken, his father, Isaiah Carter, saw the truth. Isaiah had spent years in the military, believing his son was safe in civilian life, that school fights were just part of growing up. But now, staring at the injuries Malik tried to hide, he realized something. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't just boys being boys. This was a war, and Malik had been losing it alone. That night, Isaiah made a decision. No more. And so Malik Carter's days of silence were over. But he didn't just wake up stronger the next day. No, he was forged. His father pushed him beyond his limits, taught him to fight, to stand his ground, to take control. And when the time finally came, when Jason Calloway stood in front of him expecting another easy win, Malik didn't hesitate. Jason thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. If you want to see what happens next, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what's coming. The breaking point. Malik's transformation. Malik. Carter had learned to live in silence. At Ridgewood High, silence was the key to survival. He knew that. He'd known it ever since Jason Calloway, the golden child of Ridgewood, the untouchable son of Richard Calloway, a wealthy school board member, had decided that Malik was his favorite target. At first, it was little things. A bump in the hallway, a snide remark in class, and the occasional snicker as Malik passed by the lunch table where Jason and his friends sat. It was easy to ignore in the beginning. He would lower his head, push forward, and pretend it didn't matter. After all, wasn't that the advice his father, Isaiah Carter, had always given him? "Pick your battles, son," he'd say. "Not every fight is worth having." But Jason Calloway had never stopped, and he never would. His small gestures quickly escalated into something bigger and more terrifying. It wasn't enough to just insult Malik. No, Jason had to assert dominance to make him feel small, like a bug beneath his boots. Jason began shoving him in the hallways, knocking his books from his hands just to see him scramble to pick them up again. And with each push, each sneer, and each shove, Malik felt himself shrink just a little more. He couldn't take it anymore. But he didn't know that yet. Not until one afternoon, when everything changed. That day, when Jason and his friends cornered Malik in the locker room after gym class, something broke inside him. A fragile, unnoticed part of him that had been cracking bit by bit, but he never acknowledged until it was too late. Malik was walking out of the locker room when Jason, followed by his two closest cronies, approached. "Carter, got a second?" Jason's voice was sharp, mocking, the kind of tone that made the air thick with tension. He couldn't even remember what Jason said next. It didn't matter. Nothing Jason said ever mattered. What mattered was that this time, Malik's body didn't obey the rules of silence he'd spent years learning to live by. He felt the rage boil beneath his skin, as hot as the blood pumping through his veins. His heart thudded in his chest, faster and harder than it ever had before. Jason stepped closer, towering over Malik like he always did, his hands shoving Malik's chest, making him stumble back. Malik's breath caught in his throat. He could hear Jason's friends laughing behind him, the sound almost deafening. And in that moment, in that instant, Malik's whole body screamed at him to do something, anything. But he didn't. Not yet. "Not gonna fight back today, huh? I guess we're just gonna make this easy, huh, Carter?" Jason's voice cut through the air like a knife. Malik's fingers clenched into fists at his sides. His father's words echoed in his mind, the words that had kept him grounded through years of torment. "Some battles are best left unchallenged, Malik. You can't win them all." But deep down, Malik knew this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about coming out on top. It was about surviving. It was about choosing to exist instead of being crushed by the weight of everyone else's expectations. And he couldn't do it anymore. Not like this. Jason shoved him again, harder this time. The rough impact against his chest knocked the air from his lungs. His back hit the cold metal locker, and he sank to the floor, his body trembling with a combination of rage and humiliation. Jason's friends roared with laughter. This wasn't new. It never was. But today, it felt different. It felt like the final straw. Jason's voice rang out in a taunt. "Oh no, looks like you dropped your books. How embarrassing. Pick 'em up, boy, don't be a punk." He kicked Malik's notebook across the floor, his boot making contact with the pages in a way that made Malik's chest tighten. For a brief moment, he was on the floor, staring at the pages of his notebook, the words he had written just hours earlier now taunting him, mocking him. "It doesn't matter. Just keep your head down and walk away. Do what they want." The words that had been his survival guide for years suddenly felt empty. What was the point? It did matter. It mattered that he felt the bruises not just on his body, but in his soul. It mattered that every day felt like a battle, just to hold on to who he was. That's when he heard it. His father's voice. Not in the locker room, not in the hallway, but deep in his mind. The sound of a steady, calm voice cutting through the storm that raged inside him. "Control the fight before it begins." It was those words, more than anything else, that snapped something inside Malik. He remembered the man who had raised him, a former soldier. A man who had fought in battles and wars and had seen the worst of what people could do to each other. Isaiah Carter had always told Malik that true strength wasn't in violence, it was in knowing when to fight and when to walk away. And in that moment, Malik finally understood the truth. This was the fight he needed to fight. Jason Calloway thought he could push him around, humiliate him, break him down, but Malik wasn't the same boy who had silently endured years of abuse. He wasn't just going to stand there anymore. He wasn't going to let Jason win. With a final deep breath, Malik stood, his body shaking with adrenaline. For the first time in his life, he let go of the fear, the shame, the years of torment. He stood up, locked eyes with Jason, and silently told him one thing with that gaze. "You're done." Jason raised his hand to shove him again, but this time, Malik was ready. He stepped into the punch, his body moving on instinct. His hands shot up, deflecting Jason's attack with a precision that stunned them both. Jason's eyes widened with surprise, but Malik didn't stop there. He followed through, landing a blow to Jason's ribs that left him gasping for air. The moment Jason staggered back, the crowd of students who had been watching, entertained, suddenly fell silent. Malik could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. He wasn't fighting for them. He wasn't fighting for anyone but himself. Jason tried to recover, swinging wildly, but Malik saw it. He saw the opening. He struck again, this time with more control, more purpose. A clean jab to Jason's jaw sent him stumbling backward, his legs buckling as he collapsed onto the cold locker room floor. For the first time, Jason Calloway was the one lying down, the one defeated. And as Jason's friends scrambled to help him up, Malik stood there, chest heaving, heart pounding in his ears. But for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never felt before. Power. It wasn't over. That night, as Malik limped home, bruised but victorious, he knew the battle wasn't over. It couldn't be. He still had to face his father. He still had to confront the man who had watched his son endure for so long. Isaiah Carter was waiting for him in the garage, the heavy scent of sweat and metal hanging in the air. Malik stepped in, his eyes catching the unmistakable tension in his father's posture. But his father didn't speak immediately. He just watched Malik, his expression unreadable. Malik stood there for a moment, the weight of the evening pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. Finally, his father spoke, his voice steady. "You want to learn how to fight?" It wasn't a question. Malik's throat tightened, his breath shallow. He knew what this meant. This was more than just a fight with Jason. This was about learning who he was, about finding the strength he'd hidden deep within. It was about something bigger, something he had yet to fully understand. Malik nodded. Isaiah didn't hesitate. "Then we start tomorrow." And so began the true transformation. His father's training was relentless, pushing Malik beyond what he thought was possible. Each day, his body grew stronger, faster, more disciplined. But it wasn't just his body. It was his mind. It was his spirit. He wasn't the same Malik anymore. He had become someone different, someone stronger. The days blurred together, and with each passing one, Malik learned more about control, about discipline, about knowing when to strike, and more importantly, when not to. And when the moment came, when he found himself standing across from Jason Calloway again, he didn't hesitate. He didn't need to prove anything. He had already won. Malik Carter was no longer a victim. As you follow Malik's journey, remember, strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Subscribe and stay with us, because Malik's story is just beginning. The Resolve of Natalie Simmons. A Battle for Justice. Natalie Simmons was no stranger to hardship. As a former Navy SEAL, she had learned long ago that the world wasn't always kind, that life didn't hand out second chances, but she had endured. The mental and physical toll of her training, the grueling missions, and the invisible scars that came with them all shaped her into the woman she was today. Strong, disciplined, capable. There was no obstacle she couldn't overcome, no challenge too great for her to face head on. At least that's what she believed, until the night her entire world was turned upside down by two detectives who used their power to break her. It started with a routine traffic stop on a quiet evening in the city. Natalie, driving home from a late shift at her job, was pulled over by detectives James Holloway and Doug Mercer. She had nothing to hide. Her record was clean, her conscience clear, but that didn't seem to matter. Holloway and Mercer were a duo that liked to flex their authority, to remind those around them who held the power. And on this night, they had decided that Natalie would be their target. It started harmlessly enough. Holloway approached her car with that cocky, arrogant swagger that made her stomach churn. "License and registration," he demanded, as if she were somehow beneath him. Natalie's training had always taught her to stay calm, to control her emotions, no matter the situation. She handed over her papers, offering only a polite, "Here you go, officer." But that wasn't enough for them. That wasn't what they were looking for. Doug Mercer was the one who took the opportunity to escalate things, stepping up to her window with an all-too-satisfied grin. "Aren't you a little far from home, ma'am? You sure you're not hiding something?" His tone dripped with suspicion, as if she were guilty of something just because of the way she looked. Natalie's heart sank. She knew what was happening. This was no longer a simple stop. They were trying to provoke her, looking for any excuse to assert their power over her. Her instincts kicked in, instincts honed over years of military training, but she knew she couldn't act on them. She couldn't let herself escalate things with these two men. So she kept her voice steady, calm, trying to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled any further. "I'm just driving home," she said, her voice soft, trying to remain non-threatening. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the words fell on deaf ears. Holloway, standing at her window, now leaned in a little too close. "You sure about that? I think I see a little attitude in your voice." His breath reeked of alcohol, his eyes bloodshot with a look that told her he wasn't interested in doing his job properly. He was looking for a fight. It all happened so quickly. One moment, Natalie was sitting in her car, doing her best to stay calm. The next, she felt Holloway's hand grab her arm, yanking her roughly from the driver's seat. Her body instinctively tensed, but she held her ground. She'd fought in far more dangerous situations, but there was something about this moment that made her stomach churn. It wasn't the physical threat, no. It was something deeper. It was the realization that she, a highly trained, accomplished woman, was being treated like a criminal by two men who were supposed to uphold the law. "What the hell are you doing?" Natalie demanded, her voice rising with frustration. She didn't care anymore about keeping her cool. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was about dignity. But Mercer stepped forward, placing a hand on her chest, pushing her back with more force than necessary. "Take it easy, sweetheart," he sneered. "We're just having a little chat. No need to get all tough on us." That was the moment Natalie snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. She had lived a life of sacrifice, of hard work and discipline. And now she was being treated like this, as if she didn't matter. But before she could say anything, Holloway slammed her against the car door, twisting her arm painfully behind her back. She fought back, not because she wanted to hurt them, but because her body was trained to react in defense. She fought back to protect herself, to stop them from humiliating her any further. But that's when everything took a dark turn. The two detectives didn't back down. They didn't try to restrain her. They overpowered her. She could hear the mocking laughter of Holloway, the taunts from Mercer. "A Navy SEAL, huh? Looks like the only thing you're good at is making excuses." His words were like a slap to the face. They weren't interested in the truth. They were enjoying this, enjoying watching her struggle. Malice dripped from every word, every action. And the worst part was that Natalie felt herself losing control. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had always been in control, always had the upper hand, but here she was, outnumbered and humiliated. The one thing that had always been her strength was being twisted against her. It was no longer about a fair fight. This was about these two men asserting dominance over her, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the complete disregard for her humanity. The scornful smirk on Holloway's face as he pushed her to the ground, the sickening satisfaction in Mercer's voice when he shouted orders to show her who's boss. It was all so unjust, so wrong. After what felt like an eternity, the men finally released her, tossing her aside like she was nothing. Her body was bruised, her pride shattered. But it was the emotional toll that hit hardest. She had been trained to face down any enemy. But this was different. This wasn't a battle on a foreign soil. This was a fight with the very system she had sworn to protect. And in that fight, she had been the one who lost. It wasn't until hours later, when she stood alone in her apartment, nursing the bruises on her arms and legs, that the full weight of what had happened hit her. She had been violated, not just physically, but emotionally. Her whole life had been built around service, honor, and duty, but none of that mattered in this moment. In their eyes, she wasn't a soldier, a hero, a woman who had fought for her country. No. In their eyes, she was just a woman to be humiliated, just another target for their abuse. It was that realization, that feeling of complete helplessness, that drove her to action. Natalie Simmons wasn't just going to let this slide. She couldn't. She couldn't let herself become another statistic. This wasn't just about defending her own honor. This was about holding these men accountable. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making them pay for what they'd done. It was about making sure they never got away with it. She reached out to a lawyer, but the legal battle that ensued was more than just paperwork. It was a war of words, of power, of politics. The legal system was stacked against her, and she knew it. The more she fought, the more obstacles were thrown in her way. But with every setback, every challenge, Natalie's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let Holloway and Mercer win. Weeks passed, then months. The media started to catch wind of her case, and the support from the public was overwhelming. People rallied behind her, united in their desire for justice. And just when she thought she couldn't take any more, when the weight of everything seemed unbearable, something shifted. The system began to listen. The lies that had been spun against her began to unravel. Evidence of the detectives' misconduct began to surface, and the public outcry grew louder. They couldn't ignore her anymore. Finally, the day came when the truth was laid bare. Holloway and Mercer were forced to face the consequences of their actions. The very men who had tried to break her were now the ones on trial, their reputations ruined, their careers shattered. And through it all, Natalie stood tall, not because she had sought revenge, but because she had fought for the one thing she had left: justice. But even as victory seemed to be within her grasp, Natalie knew that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustice to confront. But she had learned something important. She had learned that the hardest battles weren't fought with fists or weapons. The hardest battles were fought with courage, with conviction, and with the unwavering belief that no one could ever take away her voice. Not again. As Natalie looked out over the city from her apartment window, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had fought back, and she had won. But more than that, she had reclaimed herself. If you're inspired by Natalie's story, if you've felt the sting of injustice and stood up for what's right, then make sure to subscribe and keep following her journey. Because sometimes the fight is just beginning. The final stand. Jaden's moment of truth. For years, Jaden Carter had endured the cruel reign of Tyler Reynolds. It wasn't just the bullying. It was the years of relentless taunts, the physical confrontations, the subtle, almost imperceptible ways that Tyler tore at Jaden's soul. Jaden had learned early on that his world was one of submission. The world at Ridgewood High wasn't a place of justice or fairness. It was a place where the strong held power and the weak were crushed under the weight of it. Jason Calloway had been a bully, yes, but Tyler was different. He was the embodiment of privilege. His father, Richard Reynolds, was well known, influential, and utterly untouchable. And Tyler, as his son, had inherited that untouchable arrogance. Jaden tried to stay under the radar, to blend in with the background. But there was no hiding from Tyler. No matter how quietly Jaden tried to slip through the hallways, no matter how much he shrank away from the confrontation that Tyler eagerly sought, Tyler always found a way to make him suffer. Every shove in the hallway, every mocking laugh, every sarcastic comment that sounded like a whisper but was meant for the whole school to hear, it chipped away at Jaden's spirit. He'd endured it all with silence. For years, he had swallowed the insults, the shame, the humiliation, thinking that if he just kept his head down, if he just played the part of the good, silent kid, it would all go away. But that silence, that inaction, came at a cost. Every day, Jaden carried it with him, bottling it up, telling himself it didn't matter, telling himself he could make it through. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. It did matter. It mattered more than he could ever explain. It all came to a head one afternoon. Jaden had just finished class, the long day dragging behind him. He could feel the pressure building, the familiar weight of anxiety settling over his chest as he made his way to the parking lot. That's when he saw Tyler. Tyler was leaning against his car, surrounded by his usual group of followers. Jaden could feel the tension in the air before Tyler even spoke. This wasn't just another one of their usual run-ins. No, this time, it was different. Tyler had been watching him all day, eyeing him in the hallways, at lunch, even in class. Jaden could feel the eyes of his classmates on him now. Some of them had been watching, some of them pretending to not notice, but everyone could sense that something was about to go down. Jaden exhaled sharply, trying to calm the storm raging inside him. He told himself he could walk away. He could just get in his car, drive home, and pretend none of this mattered. But there was a part of him, a part he hadn't even fully realized until that very moment, that told him this wasn't just another fight. It was the fight. The fight for his dignity, his self-respect, his very identity. Tyler pushed off from his car, taking slow, deliberate steps toward him, that arrogant smirk already spreading across his face. Well, if it isn't Jaden Carter," he taunted, his voice sharp, dripping with mockery. The crowd behind him chuckled, entertained by the spectacle that was about to unfold. Jaden's breath quickened, but he didn't back away. He didn't retreat. Not this time. He squared his shoulders, standing tall despite the doubt that crept into his chest. You know, Carter, Tyler continued, stepping closer. You really thought you could just hide in the shadows forever? You thought you could just walk away and no one would notice. But here's the thing. You don't belong here. You never did. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows that. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest, his fists clenching at his sides. He could feel the anger building inside him. Anger not just at Tyler, but at himself. He'd taken this for years. Years of being humiliated, of being forced to shrink into the background. How much longer could he keep doing it? How many more years would he let someone like Tyler define who he was? How many more moments would he let slip by before he stopped caring what others thought? Tyler's words cut through him like a knife. What's wrong, Carter? Gonna stay silent again? I thought you were supposed to be the tough guy. Guess not. He shoved Jaden's shoulder, the force of it knocking Jaden back a step. Laughter erupted from the crowd, but Jaden didn't flinch. He stood his ground. For the first time in his life, he stood his ground. Tyler continued to press, his voice dripping with cruelty. Come on, Jaden, don't be a coward. Pick your books up, walk away. Do what you always do. Stay in your lane. The crowd, like a pack of wolves, waited for Jaden to back down. They expected him to crumble, to shrink in fear. But this time, Jaden didn't. This time, he didn't bend. He didn't retreat. For the first time in years, the words of his father echoed in his mind. Control the fight before it begins. And that's when Jaden made his decision. He wasn't going to fight with anger. He wasn't going to let his rage control him. He would finish this fight, not out of spite, but with precision. He would make it count once and for all. Jaden bent down to pick up his books, his eyes never leaving Tyler's. The crowd watched, waiting, breath held. This time, Jaden wasn't giving them what they wanted. He wasn't giving them the satisfaction of seeing him defeated. No. This time he was going to make them see him, really see him. The moment Tyler made his move, Jaden was ready. As Tyler shoved him once again, pushing him backward with more force than necessary, Jaden didn't hesitate. He moved, his body reacting instinctively, his training, his time in the gym, everything his father had taught him, all coming together in that one moment. He sidestepped, redirecting Tyler's momentum, then countered with a sharp strike to Tyler's ribs. The impact was clean, controlled, and it sent Tyler stumbling back. The crowd gasped, the shock rippling through the students who had gathered to watch. Tyler, who had always been the untouchable one, the bully who got away with everything, now found himself on the defensive. His arrogant smirk had faded, replaced by something else. Surprise. For the first time, Tyler Reynolds wasn't in control. Jaden didn't wait for Tyler to recover. He advanced, his movements fluid and calculated. A jab, a hook, a strike to Tyler's jaw, each one precise, each one sending Tyler further into retreat. The moment Tyler's back hit the pavement, Jaden knew it was over. This time, he had won. For the first time in years, Jaden Carter stood tall, his fists still clenched, but not out of anger. No, this time, he was in control. He wasn't the kid who had been pushed around anymore. He wasn't the one who let others define him. He was the one who decided his fate. But that wasn't the end. No. Tyler's defeat was just the beginning. As Jaden stood there, watching Tyler scramble to his feet, the crowd fell silent. No one had expected this. No one had expected the quiet, reserved kid, the one who had always kept his head down, to stand up and fight back, and win. But now, Jaden's victory wasn't just about this fight. It was about everything that had led him here. The years of silence, the years of humiliation, and the years of wondering if he was ever going to be enough. Jaden wasn't just winning a fight. He was winning his own life back. As Tyler slinked off, humiliated and broken, Jaden didn't feel the rush of triumph he thought he would. Instead, he felt something far deeper: relief. He had taken back what was always his dignity, his power, his place in this world. He no longer had to hide. He no longer had to shrink. The burden that had weighed on his shoulders for years had lifted in an instant, replaced with the knowledge that he had finally become the man he was always meant to be. But the truth was, Jaden's journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It wasn't just about one fight, one victory. It was about continuing to stand tall, continuing to push forward, no matter what the world threw at him. This victory wasn't just his. It belonged to anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Anyone who had ever been made to feel small. Jaden Carter's story was one of resilience, of strength, and of the unwavering belief that no one could ever take away your voice, your power, or your place in this world. If you've ever felt like you were in Jaden's shoes, like you were pushed down, humiliated, or made to feel small, then you know what it means to fight back. And Jaden's victory is yours too. Like this video to support Jaden, and all those who dare to stand up, and share this story with others who need to hear it. Because Jaden's fight isn't over yet, and neither is yours. The world can try to break you down, but just like Jaden, you can rise again, stronger than ever before. The Unseen. Fight for Justice. Daniel and Jaden. Carter's unbreakable bond. Daniel Carter had never been one to back down from a fight. As a former Delta Force operative, he'd spent years in combat, battling enemies in the most dangerous corners of the world. He had seen things that most people would never understand, but those experiences had shaped him into the man he was today. Strong, disciplined, and fiercely protective of the people he loved. For all his strength, though, there was one battle that he had never been prepared for. The battle to protect his son, Jaden, from a world that didn't seem to care. Jaden, for most of his life, had lived under the shadow of a world that was hostile, unfair, and unforgiving. Ridgewood High, a place where privilege reigned supreme, and the bullies were never held accountable, was a daily reminder that the system was stacked against people like him. His life had been one of quiet endurance, of swallowing pain and humiliation, of keeping his head down and pretending that everything would eventually get better. He had learned early on to accept it, to live with it. Every taunt, every shove, every mocking laugh from Tyler Reynolds and his group of privileged followers had been just another part of his daily routine. But Daniel knew. He had seen the changes in his son long before Jaden had ever spoken a word about what was happening at school. He had noticed how Jaden's shoulders had become more tense, how he rarely made eye contact anymore, how he had begun to retreat further and further into himself. Daniel wasn't a fool. He could read the signs, could see the silent suffering in Jaden's eyes, and it broke his heart every single day. But he couldn't protect him. Not until Jaden was ready to fight for himself. The hardest thing Daniel ever had to do was stand by and watch his son endure this torment, knowing that the only way Jaden would truly be free of it was to find the strength within himself to stand up and fight back. And then came the day that everything changed. The day that Jaden came home, not just physically beaten, but emotionally broken. His father had seen the bruises on his body before, but this time it was different. There was something heavier in Jaden's eyes, a deep sadness that Daniel had never seen before. For the first time, Jaden had lost hope. The same kid who had spent years quietly enduring his suffering had finally broken, not because of the physical pain, but because of the realization that no matter how much he tried to survive, he was still being crushed by the weight of it all. And Daniel knew, in that moment, that the time for standing by had passed. He couldn't let his son live like this anymore. The decision was made. Daniel would do whatever it took to teach Jaden how to fight, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. He would teach him the strength that could only come from within, the kind of strength that would carry him through the darkest moments. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at Tyler Reynolds or anyone else who had tormented Jaden. It was about reclaiming his power, about showing him that he didn't have to be a victim anymore. The first lesson came in the garage. Daniel didn't waste any time. He took Jaden straight to the heavy bag, the same one that had been hanging in the garage for years, collecting dust. "You want to learn how to fight?" Daniel had asked, his voice calm, but filled with the weight of something deeper, something stronger than Jaden had ever known. "Then we start now." Jaden, still bruised and broken, looked at his father with a mix of fear and confusion. He had always thought fighting was just about throwing punches, about anger and vengeance. But Daniel showed him that it wasn't. Fighting was about control. It was about knowing yourself, knowing your limits, and knowing when to push through them. Daniel didn't give Jaden a choice. He made him run, miles, hours, until his legs trembled and his lungs burned. He made him hit the bag over and over again until the pain became familiar and the exhaustion became a distant thought. It wasn't easy. It wasn't supposed to be. But through every drill, every push, every moment of doubt, Jaden began to feel something he had never felt before. Strength. Real strength. Days blurred together in a haze of sweat, bruises, and pain. But with every passing moment, Jaden grew stronger. He wasn't just becoming faster or better at hitting the bag. He was becoming someone different. Someone who could take control. Someone who could stand up for himself and face down the things that had tormented him for so long. And the most important lesson Daniel taught him wasn't about physical strength. It was about discipline. It was about learning how to control your emotions and your reactions, even when everything inside you wanted to explode. Jaden didn't understand it at first. He hated it. He hated the hours of grueling training, the constant pushing, the fact that his father seemed to be preparing him for something that Jaden wasn't even sure he was ready for. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about the training. It was about what came after. It was about the confidence that came with knowing you could face anything. The confidence that came from knowing that you were in control. Then the day arrived. The moment that had been building for weeks. Jaden walked into the parking lot after school, expecting another ordinary encounter with Tyler Reynolds. But this time, something was different. Tyler was waiting for him, as usual, surrounded by his usual group of followers. But there was no arrogance in Tyler's posture anymore. There was no smug smile on his face. Instead, there was a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the armor that had once made him seem invincible. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't feel fear. No, for the first time he felt something else, resolve. Tyler made his move first, of course. He shoved Jaden, just like always. But this time Jaden didn't stumble. This time he stood his ground. He didn't flinch, didn't fall back. Tyler's face twisted in confusion, anger, and frustration. "What's wrong, Carter? You finally grown a spine?" Tyler taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. But Jaden didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had learned that words didn't matter anymore. It was about action. And in that moment, Jaden took control of the fight, before it even began. With a swift movement, He sidestepped Tyler's next shove, striking him cleanly in the ribs with the precision his father had taught him. The impact knocked Tyler back, his smug grin fading as he struggled to keep his balance. The crowd that had gathered around them fell silent, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Jaden didn't stop there. He moved with purpose, with control. Every punch, every movement was calculated, deliberate. A jab to Tyler's stomach, a hook to his jaw, and then finally a strike that sent Tyler sprawling to the ground. For a moment, there was a hushed silence. No one could believe what they had just seen. Tyler Reynolds, the untouchable king of Ridgewood High, had been knocked down. Jaden stood over him, chest heaving, but not out of anger. No, Jaden was calm, in control. He had done what he had been taught to do. He had taken control of the fight, and in doing so, he had taken back his life. The weight that had been hanging over him for so long, years of torment and humiliation, finally lifted. For the first time, Jaden knew what it felt like to win. But even as Tyler scrambled to his feet, Jaden wasn't interested in fighting anymore. He wasn't interested in proving anything. He had already proved everything he needed to. He had proven that he wasn't weak, that he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't going to let someone like Tyler Reynolds dictate his life anymore. Jaden walked away, not in triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had reclaimed his power. The world was different now. Ridgewood High was different now. People looked at Jaden differently. They no longer saw him as the victim, the one who was always pushed around. They saw him for who he was, a fighter, someone who had taken control of his destiny. The whispers that had followed him through the halls, the mocking laughter that had once haunted his every step, had finally fallen silent. But Jaden's victory wasn't just his own. It was the victory of anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, anyone who had ever been made to feel small, anyone who had ever been pushed to the brink of breaking. Jaden Carter's story was one of resilience, of strength, and of the unwavering belief that no matter how many times life knocked you down, you always had the power to get back up. If you've ever felt like you're not enough, if you've ever faced the kind of bullying or humiliation that Jaden did, comment below to show your support. Share your story, your struggle, and your triumphs. Together, we can remind ourselves and each other that we are never defined by the people who try to break us. We are defined by how we rise. Jaden Carter showed us that victory isn't just about winning the fight. It's about claiming the strength inside yourself to keep moving forward. And now, it's your turn. The aftermath of victory, Tyler's fall, and the struggle for power. When Jaden Carter walked into the school parking lot that afternoon, he knew something was different. It wasn't just the air. It felt thicker, heavier, as if the tension of the past few weeks had finally come to a head. The whispers, the side glances, the feeling of everyone watching him. It was all building to something he couldn't ignore. Ridgewood High had always felt like a battlefield, a place where the strong triumphed and the weak withered away. For so long, Jaden had been the one to fade into the background, never daring to stand up for himself, never daring to speak out against the bullies who had tormented him day after day. But that had changed. The world he had once known, where Tyler Reynolds was the king, where his every move was met with fear and awe, was about to shatter. It had started with one moment, one decision to fight back. That was all it took. One choice to take control of his life, to no longer be a victim. The fight that had broken out in the parking lot, with Tyler pushing him to his limit, had been the catalyst. Tyler had underestimated him, had assumed that Jaden would remain the quiet, compliant target he had always been. But Jaden didn't back down. He didn't flinch or cower in fear. This time, he stood tall. With every punch that he landed, every step he took toward Tyler, something inside him grew stronger. It wasn't just his body that was changing, it was his mind, his spirit. And when Tyler crumpled to the ground, the smirk wiped from his face, Jaden felt something shift within him. The fight was over. Or so he thought. Tyler Reynolds wasn't a typical bully. He was dangerous in a way that went beyond physical intimidation. His power wasn't just in his fists. It was in his presence, in his father's connections, in the world that had always bent to his will. Tyler had made it clear, over and over again, that he was untouchable. His father, Richard Reynolds, was a fixture of the town. On the school board, a man whose influence stretched into every corner of Ridgewood. He had built his empire on a foundation of privilege and entitlement, and Tyler had inherited it all. No one challenged him. Not truly. No one ever questioned his actions because they were too afraid of the repercussions. But when Jaden knocked him down, when he stood over Tyler and watched him struggle to regain his footing, it wasn't just Tyler who lost that day. It was the entire system. Jaden had become the symbol of resistance, the embodiment of defiance against a world that had always been stacked in Tyler's favor. For the first time in his life, Jaden had taken control, and nothing would ever be the same. But Tyler wasn't someone who took defeat lightly. He was a bully, yes, but he was also the product of a system that had always protected him. The defeat he suffered at Jaden's hands didn't just bruise his ego, it shattered it. He wasn't used to losing, and that loss tore him apart in ways that Jaden couldn't even comprehend. Tyler wasn't just humiliated in front of his friends and classmates. He was exposed. He was vulnerable. And Tyler didn't know how to handle that vulnerability. The aftermath of the fight wasn't as clean as Jaden had hoped. The school, the community, everyone who had once looked the other way, now found themselves caught in the wake of Jaden's stand. Tyler was no longer the king. His crown had fallen, and the world that had once revolved around him was now shifting, slowly but surely, into something that Tyler couldn't control. The power that he had taken for granted was crumbling. And Richard Reynolds, Tyler's father, wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. Richard Reynolds wasn't just angry, he was furious. His entire life, his entire identity had been built around the idea that his son was untouchable, that nothing and no one could challenge him. And now, here was Jaden Carter, a kid who had been quietly suffering under Tyler's torment for years, standing up and knocking his son down. Richard wasn't going to let that stand. He wasn't going to let Jaden walk away unscathed. The phone call came late that night, just hours after Jaden had returned home, bruised but triumphant. The doorbell rang, shattering the calm of the evening, and when Jaden opened it, he saw the figure of Richard Reynolds standing on his doorstep, his face twisted in rage. It was like something straight out of a nightmare. A man who had once been untouchable, now standing before him, desperate for control. Richard's words were sharp, cutting, filled with a venom that made Jaden's skin crawl. "You think you can just do that to my son and walk away?" he spat. "You think this is over? You think you can beat my son and get away with it? You've made a grave mistake, Carter. This isn't over." Jaden stood there, facing Richard, his heart pounding in his chest. But this time, there was no fear. There was no hesitation. He had already won. He had already proven that he was stronger than the world that had tried to break him. He wasn't afraid of Richard Reynolds anymore. He wasn't afraid of anything. But the fight wasn't over. It wasn't just the battle with Tyler that Jaden had to win. It was the fight with the system that protected people like Tyler. Richard Reynolds wasn't going to let his son lose without a fight, and now Jaden found himself in the middle of a battle that went beyond high school bullying. It was a battle for justice, for fairness, for a place in the world where the powerful didn't always win. The legal battles began soon after. Richard, using his influence, pulled every string he could to make sure that Jaden's victory was undone. He used his connections, his money, his power to make sure that the fight wouldn't just go away. He wanted Jaden expelled. He wanted him destroyed. He wanted to make an example of him, to show everyone that no one, not even someone like Jaden, could defy the system and win. But what Richard didn't understand was that Jaden wasn't the same kid anymore. He wasn't the kid who would cower in fear. He wasn't the kid who would back down just because someone more powerful told him to. He had already won his freedom. He had already won the most important battle of his life. Now, he was ready to fight for what was right. Jaden had found an unlikely ally in his father, Daniel Carter. Daniel, with his years of experience and his unshakable resolve, was not going to let this happen. The legal battle that ensued was fierce, with Richard pulling every trick in the book to try to ruin Jaden's future. But Daniel wasn't one to back down. He stood by his son, helping him navigate the complicated legal system, teaching him that true strength didn't come from physical power alone. It came from the will to never give up, no matter what the world threw at you. In the end, the truth came out. Evidence surfaced that proved Tyler had been the aggressor all along. Videos from students who had witnessed the fight, recordings from the school's security cameras. It all came together to paint a clear picture of what had really happened that day. The school board was forced to take action. Tyler Reynolds was placed on probationary suspension, and Jaden's expulsion was dropped. But that wasn't the end of the story. The emotional toll it had taken on Jaden, the weight of the battle, had left scars deeper than the physical ones. It wasn't just about winning the fight. It wasn't just about proving Tyler wrong or standing up to Richard Reynolds. It was about what it took to get to that point. The internal struggle, the pain, the doubts, the fear, the loneliness. Jaden had been forced to grow up faster than any teenager should have to. And while he had won the battle, the emotional cost was something he wasn't sure he would ever fully overcome. As Jaden walked out of the school for the last time, victorious and free, he knew that the world had changed. It wasn't just Ridgewood High. It was everything. The system that had kept people like Tyler and Richard Reynolds at the top, the system that had made people like him feel small, it was starting to crack. And Jaden had been a part of that. Now, as Jaden stood with his father, Daniel's hand resting firmly on his shoulder, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt powerful. Not because he had knocked Tyler down, not because he had won the fight. He felt powerful because he had taken control of his own life. He had reclaimed his place in this world, and nothing would ever take that away from him. If you're inspired by Jaden's journey, by the fight he endured, and the strength he showed in standing up for himself, comment below to show your support for him. Your words could be the encouragement someone else needs to find their own strength and stand tall against the world. Jaden's fight isn't just his own. It's a fight for all of us who've ever felt small, ever felt weak, ever felt like the system was stacked against us. Together, we can rise. Together, we can be strong. Together, we can be unstoppable. The Reckoning. Daniel and Jaden's last stand. The night was still, suffocating in its quietness, as the shadows of Ridgewood High's parking lot stretched long under the dim light of the street lamps. Jaden stood there, looking out across the space where only weeks ago he had faced Tyler Reynolds, his tormentor, his bully, the embodiment of everything that had crushed him for years. But tonight, everything was different. Tonight, there was a weight on his chest that wasn't just about the fight. It wasn't just about the way he had taken control, punched back, and walked away from the humiliation of years past. No. Tonight, Jaden could feel it. The finality of the battle wasn't over yet. Tyler had been knocked down, yes, but what awaited him now was something far more dangerous than any physical fight could ever be. The feeling of victory, though sweet, had been hollowed by the realization that Tyler's father, Richard Reynolds, wasn't going to let this go. Richard, the powerful, untouchable figure of Ridgewood, wasn't just going to allow his son's defeat at the hands of someone like Jaden to go unchallenged. Jaden knew it. He felt it in the cold air around him as he stood alone in the parking lot, his fists still clenched at his sides. The very world that had once been controlled by men like Richard was now swirling around him, and he couldn't escape it. The system was designed to protect them, to give them every advantage, everything that would stop someone like him from having any kind of justice, any kind of peace. Jaden couldn't walk away from this. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about what his victory had meant, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever felt the weight of oppression, of humiliation, of not being seen. It was about making sure that people like Tyler and Richard Reynolds couldn't keep pushing others down, couldn't keep asserting their dominance, simply because they had the power to do so. This battle, this fight for justice, was far from over. And Jaden knew that the fight wasn't going to end with the school board's decision. It would be more personal, more brutal. The true cost of standing up to men like Richard Reynolds was something he hadn't even begun to understand yet. That night, after the fight, Jaden returned home, bruised, tired, and quiet. He had expected to feel some kind of overwhelming satisfaction, a relief that came from knowing that he had beaten the system. But what he didn't anticipate was the weight of the silence that followed. Inside his house, it was as though the air itself was thick with something unspoken, something ominous. The stillness between him and his father, Daniel, was palpable. Daniel hadn't said anything at first, but Jaden could feel the pressure building between them, the acknowledgement of everything that had changed, everything that was about to change. Jaden could see it in his father's eyes, that look of understanding. It wasn't over. When Daniel spoke, his voice was steady, like the calm before a storm. "You did what you had to do, son, but don't think for a second that it ends here. They'll come for you. They'll come for both of us." His words cut through the air like a blade. Jaden wasn't ready for the truth. He had expected this to be over once Tyler walked away. Once Tyler had been knocked to the ground, once the whole school had witnessed his defeat, he had thought that was the end of it. But now, standing in the living room, with his father looking at him with the weight of a man who had seen too many battles to count, Jaden realized he had been living in a dream. Richard Reynolds wasn't just going to let his son's defeat slip away into the shadows. He wasn't going to accept the public humiliation of his son being beaten by someone like Jaden, someone from a background like his. Jaden knew what was coming next. The phone call, the doorbell, the man at his doorstep. Richard Reynolds would come for him. He would use every ounce of power and influence he had to make sure that Jaden paid for what had happened. And so the night stretched on, with Daniel preparing for what was inevitably to come. Not with anger, but with cold, hard resolve. He had fought in wars, in conflicts where survival was the only thing that mattered, And now he was facing an enemy that was just as ruthless, but in a different way. By the time Richard Reynolds arrived at their door, the tension in the house had reached a breaking point. The knock at the door was loud and forceful, a demand for attention, a demand for an explanation. Jaden's heart raced in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. The final reckoning had arrived. He knew what his father had told him. This wasn't over. But hearing that knock, feeling the weight of it in his bones, made the reality feel even more crushing. When the door opened, Richard Reynolds stood there, his face contorted in anger, his hands clenched at his sides. The man who had spent years walking through life with his chest puffed out. The man who had always had the power to silence those who dared to challenge him, now stood at their doorstep, humbled by the reality of his son's defeat. His pride, his entire world, had just been shattered. And Richard didn't know how to handle it. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Richard hissed, his voice barely contained, like a man teetering on the edge of something much darker. "You think you can just come in here and humiliate my son? Ruin everything I've built? You think you're some kind of hero?" His words hit Jaden like a physical blow, and the urge to step back, to retreat, came over him like a wave. But he didn't. This was the moment. Before Jaden could even respond, his father stepped forward, meeting Richard Reynolds with a calmness that only someone who had faced far worse could muster. "No," Daniel said, his voice even, but there was something in it that made the room feel smaller. "I don't think I'm a hero, but I do think that sometimes a man has to make a choice, and you've crossed the line." Richard's face twisted, fury boiling in his chest, but Daniel didn't flinch. There was a sharpness to the way he spoke, a sharpness that sent a chill through the room. He knew exactly what was coming. Richard Reynolds had pushed too far, and now, like any man who had crossed into the realm of personal attack, he had to face the consequences of his actions. "I'm done hiding," Daniel continued, his words measured, each one falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. "I've spent my life fighting in wars, and I've seen things that would break most men. But I'm standing here, looking you in the eye, and I'll tell you this. Your son might have been untouchable before, but now he's just another man who learned the hard way." Richard's hands shook with rage as he stepped forward, shoving Daniel with a force that sent the room spinning. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he growled, voice low and menacing. But Daniel stood tall. He didn't flinch. He didn't even take a step back. Instead, he stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. He didn't need to raise his fists. He didn't need to shout or scream. His very being exuded a quiet strength that made Richard stop in his tracks. "No," Daniel said, voice firm, each word like a command. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I'm not afraid of you." The silence that followed felt like it could last forever. The room was thick with tension, the weight of everything hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. Richard stood there, staring at Daniel, his jaw clenched so tightly that it looked like it might snap. He had no words left, no more lies to hide behind. And just like that, the battle shifted. Daniel didn't need to fight physically. He had already won. And as Richard Reynolds finally turned to leave, defeated and humiliated, Daniel stepped back into the house, his face unreadable. Jaden stood there, his heart still racing in his chest. But something had changed. The weight of the moment, the intensity of it, had made him realize something that had been hidden inside him all along. He was never going to be the same. He wasn't just a kid who had been pushed around. He wasn't just a victim of a broken system. He was free. The fight had been long, and the struggle was far from over. But Jaden knew one thing for sure. He had taken control of his own life. And nothing, Not Richard Reynolds, not the system that had protected men like him, could ever take that away. If you're inspired by Jaden's story, if you've ever felt like you've been pushed down, humiliated, or broken by the weight of the world, comment below to show your support. Let Jaden's journey be a reminder that we all have the power to rise, to reclaim our lives, and to take back what's rightfully ours. You're not alone in this fight. Together, we can make sure that no one ever has to stand down again.